The dispute over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, did not begin when the first stone was laid in 2011. Its roots stretch back through decades of regional politics and perceived historical injustices. A timeline of this conflict shows key flashpoints. The 1959 Nile Waters Agreement between Egypt and Sudan, which allocated the river's entire flow between them, notably excluding Ethiopia. Then, the surprise announcement of the GERD project in 2011, a moment of national pride for Ethiopia, but one that sent shockwaves downstream to Cairo. The subsequent years have been marked by a cycle of negotiations, declarations of principles, and repeated breakdowns in talks, particularly as Ethiopia began the multi-year process of filling the dam's massive reservoir in 2020 without a binding agreement in place, escalating tensions to their highest point. For Egypt, the Nile is not just a river, it is a singular source of existence. Over 97% of the country's freshwater comes from this one artery, flowing through a landscape that is otherwise hyper-arid desert. It dictates where people live, where crops are grown, and where cities thrive. The Greek historian Herodotus famously called Egypt the gift of the Nile, a description that remains profoundly true today. Any perceived threat to the volume of its flow is therefore treated as an existential crisis, a matter of national security that touches every single citizen. It is a lifeline that has sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia, and its uninterrupted flow is considered a non-negotiable birthright by its people and its leaders. In stark contrast, for Ethiopia, the Nile, specifically its main tributary, the Blue Nile, represents a different kind of promise. It is the source of unrealized potential and a symbol of a future powered by its own natural resources. Ethiopia contributes over 85% of the total water that flows into the Nile, yet it has historically benefited little from it. The river's power has rushed downstream, leaving much of the Ethiopian population without access to electricity and mired in poverty. The GERD is therefore seen as a declaration of sovereignty and a critical engine for economic development. It promises to electrify millions of homes and industries, lifting the nation out of poverty and asserting its rightful place as a regional power. This fundamental divergence in perspective is the heart of the conflict. One nation sees the river as a historical legacy to be preserved, a fragile lifeline that must not be tampered with. The other sees it as a future resource to be harnessed, a key to unlocking national development and correcting a historical imbalance. Egypt's position is rooted in its absolute dependency, fearing that the dam gives Ethiopia ultimate control over its water supply. Ethiopia's stance is driven by its developmental ambitions, viewing the dam as a sovereign right to utilize a resource originating within its borders. Both positions are deeply held, passionately defended, and central to their national identities, making a simple compromise incredibly difficult to achieve. The legal foundations of the dispute are built on the shifting sands of colonial history. Egypt and Sudan frequently point to treaties from 1929 and 1959 as the basis for their water rights. The 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, signed during British colonial rule, granted Egypt veto power over any upstream projects that could affect its water share. The 1959 agreement, a bilateral pact between Egypt and Sudan, allocated specific quantities of water to each country, effectively dividing the entire annual flow of the Nile between themselves. These documents form the cornerstone of Cairo's legal argument, presenting its access to the Nile's waters not merely as a need, but as an established historical right that must be respected by all other nations on the river's course. Ethiopia, however, vehemently rejects these colonial-era agreements as invalid and unjust. It argues that it was never a signatory to these treaties and cannot be bound by documents drafted to serve the interests of colonial powers and downstream nations. From Addis Abeba's perspective, these agreements are relics of an imperial past that systematically excluded Ethiopia, the source of the majority of the river's water, from any say over its own resources. Instead, Ethiopia champions the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization, a cornerstone of modern international water law. This principle suggests that all riparian states have a right to use the waters of a shared river, so long as it does not cause significant harm to other states. The clash is therefore not just over water, but over which legal and historical framework should govern the world's longest river. Egypt's position relies on preserving a status quo established by historical precedent, which has guaranteed its water security for nearly a century. This perspective emphasizes established rights and the prevention of significant harm to its population. Ethiopia's argument is a call for a fundamental reset, a move away from what it sees as an inequitable past toward a more modern, cooperative framework where the benefits of the Nile are shared among all the countries in the basin. It is a direct challenge to the old order, demanding a new arrangement based on contemporary principles of international law. This legal and historical disagreement has created an unbridgeable chasm in negotiations. When Egypt speaks of its historical rights, Ethiopia hears the language of colonial imposition. When Ethiopia speaks of equitable utilization, Egypt hears a direct threat to the water supply that sustains its 110 million people. This deep-seated divergence means that the two sides are often arguing from completely different starting points, making it nearly impossible to find common ground. The treaties of the past cast a long shadow over the present, ensuring that every discussion about cubic meters of water is also a debate about history, sovereignty, and post-colonial justice. The physical act of filling the GERD's vast reservoir, a process that began in the summer of 2020, transformed the dispute from a theoretical debate into an immediate crisis. This multi-year process is the most sensitive phase of the dam's operation. For Ethiopia, a swift filling schedule is economically vital. A faster fill means the dam's turbines can begin generating electricity at full capacity sooner, allowing the country to start repaying its loans and powering its development. Each year of delay represents a significant economic loss and postpones the promise of prosperity that the dam represents to its citizens. The filling is thus a technical necessity directly linked to the project's financial viability and its developmental goals. Egypt, and, to a lesser extent, Sudan, view this process with extreme apprehension. Their primary demand has been for a legally binding agreement that governs both the filling and the long-term operation of the dam, especially during periods of drought. Cairo fears that a rapid fill, particularly if it coincides with a low rainfall year on the Blue Nile, could severely reduce the water flowing into its own High Aswan Dam reservoir. This could have catastrophic consequences for Egyptian agriculture, municipal water supplies, and hydropower generation. Consequently, Egypt has insisted on a slower, more adaptive filling schedule that is responsive to annual rainfall levels and legally enforceable rules for releasing water in the future. The failure to reach a consensus on this critical issue has led to a complete breakdown in formal negotiations. The core of the disagreement lies in the nature of a potential deal. Ethiopia is willing to commit to data sharing and cooperative guidelines, but has steadfastly refused to be locked into a legally binding treaty that it believes would limit its future sovereignty over the dam and the river. It sees such a treaty as another version of the colonial-era agreements that constrained its development. Egypt, haunted by its water vulnerability, sees anything less than a legally binding international treaty as insufficient to protect its vital national interests, viewing flexible guidelines as meaningless without a robust enforcement mechanism. This impasse has been compounded by a profound and ever-deepening mistrust. Each unilateral action is interpreted in the worst possible light by the other side. When Ethiopia proceeds with another stage of filling, Egypt views it as a provocative act of defiance that ignores its legitimate concerns. When Egypt engages in diplomatic campaigns to rally international pressure, Ethiopia sees it as an attempt to undermine its sovereignty and sabotage its national flagship project. This cycle of suspicion has poisoned the atmosphere for dialogue, turning technical discussions about reservoir levels and flow rates into intractable political confrontations where neither side feels it can afford to make the first concession. The Nile dispute is far more than a technical or legal argument. It is deeply interwoven with the national identity of both Ethiopia and Egypt. In Egypt, the Nile is a central element of national consciousness, a sacred entity celebrated in song, literature, and political rhetoric for millennia. Control over the Nile is synonymous with the strength and stability of the Egyptian state itself. Any challenge to this control is perceived as a challenge to the nation's very identity and its historical role as the dominant power in the region. This makes compromise politically perilous for any Egyptian leader, as it could be framed as a surrender of the nation's soul and its future. For Ethiopia, the GERD has become a powerful symbol of national renaissance, unity, and defiance. The project has been largely financed through public contributions and government bonds, making it a source of immense collective pride. It represents a break from a past marked by famine, internal conflict, and international marginalization. The dam is a tangible assertion of Ethiopia's ability to determine its own destiny and harness its natural wealth for its people. This potent nationalist sentiment means that any perceived concession on the dam is seen as a betrayal of the national dream. The project unites Ethiopians across ethnic and political divides, embodying a shared aspiration for a more prosperous and respected future. The dispute has also reshaped regional politics, creating shifting and often tense alliances. Egypt has worked to strengthen its ties with countries in the Gulf and other parts of Africa to isolate Ethiopia diplomatically. It has also deepened its security and political cooperation with Sudan, which shares some of Egypt's concerns about the dam's operational safety and water flow. In response, Ethiopia has sought to build support among other upstream Nile Basin countries, promoting a narrative of shared rights to water resources against what it portrays as downstream hegemony. This has turned the Nile Basin into a chessboard of competing interests, where external powers often play a role, further complicating any direct path to resolution. Looking ahead, the path to a sustainable agreement remains fraught with difficulty. The fundamental reason for the failure of talks has been the inability to reconcile Egypt's demand for water security enshrined in a binding treaty, with Ethiopia's insistence on developmental sovereignty. To break the deadlock, trust-building measures are essential. This could begin with a binding commitment to share real-time operational data and establishing a joint technical committee to manage drought mitigation. Without such steps, the risk of miscalculation remains high. A continued stalemate not only jeopardizes regional stability, but also prevents the kind of cooperation that could unlock the Nile's full potential for all its people, risking a future of conflict over a resource that could otherwise be a source of shared prosperity.